the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a curious incident shatters the calm when several villagers report the same event. But each swears it happened differently. A missing object, a witness who contradicts herself, and a timeline that refuses to make sense. As rumors spread like wildfire, only Miss Marple notices the subtle details everyone else overlooks. Why are the accounts conflicting? Who has something to hide? And what truth lies beneath the tangled stories? One quiet observation may reveal everything, or destroy the village's peace forever. Chapter 1. The Incident at Meadow Lane. The village of St. Mary Mead had a way of greeting each morning with an almost scripted charm, as if the place itself were accustomed to being observed and admired. On the particular Thursday upon which our story begins, the air was crisp, touched by the faintest scent of late summer roses drifting from gardens immaculately kept. The milkman made his quiet rounds, the postmistress prepared her letters in tidy stacks, and the church bells gave their usual half-hearted chime. Not too intrusive, yet not easily ignored. And at the heart of this gentle scene, in a cottage covered in climbing ivy, sat Miss Jane Marple, slender knitting needles in hand. Her expression contained that delicate mixture of curiosity and serenity so uniquely hers, as though she knitted not merely wool but the very threads of the village's secrets. She had just settled into her chair by the window, where the first sunbeams warmed the embroidered curtains, when she noticed a flurry of activity along Meadow Lane. That unlikely stretch of road where nothing more dramatic than a loose chicken or a squeaky bicycle chain usually occurred. Yet this morning something looked off. Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, was hurrying along the lane in her too large hat, clutching her handbag as if it contained the crown jewels. Moments later came Miss Hartwell, who rarely left her cottage before midday, rushing in the same direction, her shawl slipping dangerously from her shoulders. And behind her was young Tommy Archer from the grocer's, pushing his delivery cart at a speed entirely unsuitable for such an uneven path. Miss Marple paused, her knitting mid-loop. Activity in St. Mary Mead was rarely chaotic without reason, and certainly never in such an oddly synchronized fashion. With a thoughtful, she placed her knitting aside, stood and reached for her walking cane. Not that she needed it, but she found it encouraged people to underestimate her spryness, often to her advantage. By the time she stepped into the morning sunlight, she could hear voices, quite agitated ones, drifting from the direction of Meadow Lane. She walked at a calm, measured pace, allowing the village to reveal its scandal in its own time. At the entrance of Meadow Lane, she found a small crowd gathered near the hedgerow bordering the old Miller cottage, an unremarkable building except for its rather peculiar history of being rented, abandoned, and rented again. At present, it belonged to a gentleman from London who visited only during the hunting season. Most villagers barely remembered his name, but today the cottage stood at the center of a very particular commotion. Mrs. Finch spotted Miss Marple first. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed in a voice much too shrill for the tranquil morning. "Such a thing has happened, and nobody can agree about what it was." Miss Marple approached with the faintest smile, the sort she reserved for situations she knew would prove delightfully complicated. "My dear Mrs. Finch, contradictions are the essence of village life," she replied. "But do tell me, what exactly is the trouble?" Mrs. Finch clasped her gloved hands together. "Well, it appears, or rather some say, that someone was seen entering the Miller cottage early this morning. But others insist the person came out of it, not went in. And still others maintain that nobody went near the place at all. It's all quite impossible." Miss Hartwell stepped forward indignantly. "I know what I saw, Mrs. Finch. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat, went inside shortly after sunrise. I was on my way to the bakery, as I always am on Thursdays. She gave Miss Marple a pointed look as though expecting absolute validation. But Tommy Archer, still breathless from pushing his cart, shook his head. "Begging your pardon, Miss Hartwell, but I saw someone come out of the cottage, not go in." "Light-colored coat it was," Mrs. Finch huffed. "That is precisely the issue. Nobody agrees. They can't even decide whether it was a man or a woman." "And I say nobody came at all," declared Mr. Cudamore, the retired schoolmaster, appearing from behind the hedge with a face already flushed with annoyance. "I stood right across the lane for a good 15 minutes waiting for young Tommy to bring my eggs, and I didn't see a soul near that cottage." Miss Marple took all of this in with the mildest nod, looking at each speaker in turn. Conflicting accounts were rarely trivial. They were, more often than not, the sign of something people believed they saw because they expected to see it, or the sign that someone had reason to lie. She stepped closer to the cottage. Its shutters were closed. The front gate, though old, hung properly in place. There was no sign of forced entry. But the ground near the threshold, now freshly trampled by the gaggle of bystanders, held hints of the morning's earlier events. A faint impression of a heel, a smudge of something pale, almost dusty, a small fragment of pale cloth snagged on the edge of the rosebush. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, bending slightly. Mrs. Finch hurried behind her. "Oh, Miss Marple, surely this means somebody was here." "It means," Miss Marple said gently, "that something occurred, but we do not yet know what." She turned to the bystanders. "Tell me again, each of you, what you saw. Slowly, please, and starting with the time." Immediately, everyone began speaking at once, a chorus of contradicting testimonies that rose into the warm air like a jumble of poorly tuned instruments. Miss Marple lifted a hand, and the villagers, when accustomed to her calm authority, quieted. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "you first." Miss Hartwell straightened, adjusting her shawl. "It was exactly 7:15. I checked the clock in my hall before leaving. I walked down Meadow Lane and saw a man in a dark coat go up to the cottage and let himself in, quite swiftly." "Did you recognize him?" Miss Marple asked. "No, but he moved with purpose." "Thank you." She turned to Tommy. "And you?" Tommy shuffled nervously. "About 7:30, miss. I was passing by with the cart and the door opened. Someone stepped out. I couldn't see the face, but the coat was light, sort of beige. They walked off toward the woods." "Did you see Miss Hartwell at that time?" "No, miss." Miss Hartwell sniffed sharply. "I was already at the bakery by then." Mr. Cudamore interjected. "Well, I was here around 7:30 and didn't see anyone come or go. Unless they were invisible." Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully over the lane. Time discrepancies, clashing descriptions, missing recognition. It was enough to pique even her well-trained curiosity. Before she could ask further questions, Mrs. Weatherby, an elderly woman who lived closest to the cottage, emerged from behind her gate. She was known for having the sharpest eyes in all of St. Mary Mead, second only to Miss Marple herself. "I suppose," she said in her raspy voice, "you're all talking about the noises." Everyone turned to her at once. "What noises, Mrs. Weatherby?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Well, at about 6:45, maybe a touch earlier, I heard rustling, like someone moving around inside the Miller cottage, very faint but quite distinct. And I heard a click, like a window unlatching." Miss Finch gasped. "Someone inside? At that early hour?" Mrs. Weatherby shrugged. "Whoever it was didn't stay long, or maybe there were two someones." The murmuring began again, rising like bees disturbed from their hive. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips together, deep in thought. With such a tangle of conflicting testimonies, the truth was unlikely to be simple. But she sensed, in that quiet, unspoken way that had guided her through countless village mysteries, that what happened here was not merely a matter of mistaken observation. Something, or someone, had inspired these contradictory stories. She stepped back, looking once more at the cottage. Closed shutters, locked door, a faint mark on the sill, a fragment of cloth, and something else. A set of footprints at the side of the house, barely visible in the earth softened by last night's drizzle. Not the villagers' prints. These were older, more purposeful, and they led not to the cottage door, but to the side window. "Very curious indeed," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Finch hovered anxiously. "Do you think it could be burglars, or a fugitive, or perhaps—" "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "in my experience, it is seldom the most dramatic explanation that proves correct. But something unusual certainly occurred here." Mrs. Finch clutched her handbag closer. "Oh, Miss Marple, do you think we're in danger?" Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "That remains to be seen." But privately she thought, "No danger at present. But something happened here that someone wishes to keep muddled." And muddled it certainly was. Only a few moments passed before the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a tall man with an easy manner, who had long ago learned to respect Miss Marple's insights. He approached the gathering with an expression poised somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "I suppose," he said, "there's a bit of excitement this morning?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite a bit, Inspector. It seems there has been an incident, though nobody can quite agree on what." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Oh? And what do they claim to have seen?" "In summary," Miss Marple replied, "one person entering the cottage, one person leaving it, and another person existing only in imagination." Craddock blinked. "That does sound conflicting." "Indeed," the inspector sighed. "Well then, I'd better take statements." He glanced at the cottage. "Locked, is it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and has likely remained so. But the window at the side may have been used." Craddock gave her a rueful smile. "I should have known you'd see something before I did." "It's merely observation," Miss Marple said lightly. "People leave traces even when they try not to." While the inspector examined the window, Miss Marple looked once more at the villagers gathered around. Mrs. Finch fanning herself with her hat, Miss Hartwell pursing her lips in indignation, Tommy Archer fidgeting, Mr. Cudamore muttering about nonsense, and Mrs. Weatherby leaning forward slightly, listening far too intently. Yes, something was amiss, and it rested not only in the physical clues near the cottage, but in the people themselves. Their expressions, their eagerness, their fear, their defensiveness. 3 villagers had told conflicting stories, but one of them, or perhaps someone else entirely, was telling a deliberate lie, and Miss Marple, with her quiet intuition and unwavering patience, knew precisely how to discover which one. She softly touched the snagged fragment of cloth, then let it fall from her fingertips. Whatever had happened inside the Miller cottage that morning, whether it involved a secret visitor, a hidden object, or something far more complicated, it had set into motion a chain of confusion that could only lead to one thing: a mystery. And in St. Mary Mead, mysteries seldom remained hidden for long, especially not when Miss Marple was watching. Chapter 2. Tea with the First Witness. The hours following the commotion at Meadow Lane passed with that peculiar mixture of excitement and unease that so often settled over St. Mary Mead whenever something even faintly unusual occurred. The villagers, though fond of routine, possessed an undeniable appetite for intrigue, particularly if it could be comfortably discussed over a slice of Battenberg cake or during a pause in the knitting circle. And so, by the time the church clock chimed 11, the rumor of the mysterious visitor at the Miller cottage had already made its way through the baker's queue, across the grocer's counter, into the vicarage garden, and, quite inevitably, through every doorway along the high street. Miss Marple, however, had chosen a very different approach to the unfolding matter. Rather than indulge in speculation or hurried conclusions, she elected in her usual quiet manner to invite the first witness, Miss Hartwell, for tea. Miss Marple had long believed that people revealed far more when seated comfortably with a warm cup in hand. It was a principle she had applied with considerable success over the years, often to the bafflement of visiting detectives who imagined that investigations required stern interrogations rather than small, carefully placed conversational nudges. Miss Hartwell arrived precisely at 11:30, dressed in her customary heavy shawl despite the mild weather. She carried an air of self-importance, as though aware that she was, for the moment, the most valuable source of information in the entire village. "My dear Miss Hartwell," Miss Marple greeted warmly, opening her garden gate, "do come in. I've made a fresh pot of Darjeeling." "Oh, Miss Marple, you are too kind," Miss Hartwell said, though her eyes sparkled with the unmistakable satisfaction of being consulted. "It has all been such a whirlwind. I can hardly gather my thoughts." "Well," Miss Marple said gently, "that is why I thought a cup of tea might help." She led her guest into the sitting room, the comforting scent of warm scones and raspberry preserves filling the air. The room, softened by lace doilies, floral wallpaper, and Miss Marple's neat stacks of knitting patterns, seemed to coax even the most agitated soul into calmness. Miss Hartwell seated herself primly on the edge of the floral sofa. "I do hope Inspector Craddock will appreciate the accuracy of my account," she declared. "One hears that these things can become quite muddled when left to people of, shall we say, less refined observational habits." Miss Marple poured the tea without comment. A familiar pattern, she mused privately. Witnesses often sought to convince not only others, but themselves that they had perceived events with perfect clarity. "Now," Miss Marple said as she offered a plate of scones, "perhaps you could tell me what you observed this morning, slowly, if you please, and from the very beginning." Miss Hartwell took a satisfied breath. "Of course. I was on my way to the bakery, as is my weekly routine every Thursday. I left my cottage at precisely 7:15. I always check the clock before stepping out." "I see," Miss Marple nodded. "And the morning was quite clear?" "Oh, yes, a bit crisp but pleasant. I walked down Meadow Lane and saw the Miller cottage naturally. Then, as I passed the hedge, I noticed movement." She paused dramatically, waiting for Miss Marple to show appropriate astonishment. Miss Marple obliged with a polite lift of the eyebrows. "It was a man," Miss Hartwell continued. "He wore a dark coat, black, I believe, and he walked up to the cottage door. He looked about him rather furtively, then took a key from his pocket and let himself inside." "A key, you say?" Miss Marple murmured. "How interesting." "It certainly was. I dare say I've seen the London gentleman who owns the place, though only from a distance, so I can assure you this was not him." "Did you see his face clearly at any point?" Miss Hartwell hesitated. "Not entirely. He kept his head down, and I did not wish to appear nosy." Miss Marple gave the subtlest smile. Miss Hartwell not wishing to appear nosy was about as likely as a hen refusing to peck grain, but she allowed the woman to continue. "He opened the door quite quickly," Miss Hartwell said, "and I heard a faint sound like something metallic. Then he stepped inside. That was all. I did not linger." Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea. "And you are certain it was a man?" "Quite certain. I know the difference between the movement of a man and a woman, Miss Marple, and his shoulders were very broad." Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "And you noticed nothing else? Nothing in his hands, perhaps?" "Nothing except the key, and the coat. Yes, I remember now, the coat was buttoned all the way to the top, which I thought rather odd for such a mild morning." "Yes, that is curious." Miss Hartwell sat back a little, clearly pleased with herself. "You see why I thought it important to report what I observed. For all we know, there may have been some criminal intention." Miss Marple gave her a warm look. "Your attentiveness is indeed helpful." Inside, however, she felt a subtle tightening of doubt. Miss Hartwell's account, though confident, was too neat, too complete, and people who saw things clearly rarely embellished their stories with such eagerness. Still, Miss Marple believed in gathering threads before deciding how they fit, or whether they fit at all. "Now," Miss Marple said softly, "may I ask you something slightly peculiar?" Miss Hartwell leaned forward eagerly. "Of course, my dear." "When you saw the man enter the cottage, what did you feel at the time? Not what you thought or assumed, but what you truly felt." The question took Miss Hartwell by surprise. She blinked several times. "Well, I suppose I felt startled. Yes, startled, because it seemed unusual." "And did you feel uneasy?" Miss Hartwell hesitated. "Perhaps, though only because one never expects to see unfamiliar men wandering about at that hour." Miss Marple noted the hesitation. People often revealed themselves most clearly in the pauses between their words. "And did you mention this to anyone before arriving at the scene later with Mrs. Finch and the others?" "Oh, no," Miss Hartwell said quickly. "I went straight to the bakery. I did not speak to a soul." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She let several seconds pass, watching Miss Hartwell fuss with her shawl before she gently shifted the subject. "You mentioned hearing a sound, a metallic sound. Could it have been the key itself? Or perhaps something else?" "It must have been the key," Miss Hartwell said firmly. "I cannot imagine what else it could be." Miss Marple thought of the faint metallic click described by Mrs. Weatherby, who claimed it had come from a window. Two witnesses, two metallic sounds, two different explanations. "Miss Hartwell," she said softly, "did the man glance back at you at all?" "No," Miss Hartwell said after a moment. "No, he did not. But that only reinforces my conviction that he wished not to be noticed." "I see," Miss Marple murmured, though she suspected the opposite. Normally, someone wishing not to be noticed would look around much more carefully. They spoke for several more minutes, during which Miss Hartwell repeated small details with slight variations. None significant enough to be called lies, yet none consistent enough to be entirely reliable. By the time she left, Miss Marple had formed the distinct impression that Miss Hartwell had indeed seen something, but not necessarily the event she so confidently described. When the door finally closed and the cottage returned to its quiet state, Miss Marple allowed herself a slow breath. She stepped to the window, peering out across her garden. The breeze rustled the sunlit leaves, and somewhere a distant church bell marked the hour. Contradictions, she thought, and contradictions were always the sign of a deeper, hidden truth. A short time later, Inspector Craddock arrived. He greeted her with a weary smile as she invited him in. "I thought it best," he said, "to compare notes." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "I have just spoken with Miss Hartwell. I believe you have spoken to her as well." "Oh, yes," Craddock said with a sigh. She seemed quite sure of herself. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite sure." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "But you aren't convinced?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Let us say, Inspector, that certainty is often the enemy of accuracy." Craddock chuckled. "You may be right. Now tell me, what struck you as odd? Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. Her account was exceedingly tidy. Every detail seemed perfectly placed, yet none of it resonated with the nature of the cottage itself. In what way? For one, she says the man used a key. But, Inspector, if someone wished to enter surreptitiously, would they use the front door? Especially when the window at the side shows clear signs of being tampered with? Craddock blinked. You think she didn't see him enter at all? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think she saw someone, but not in the manner she described, and not at the time she believed she did. Craddock paced toward the mantelpiece, hands clasped behind him. Then why give such a detailed account? Oh, people often embroider what they recall, particularly those who wish to appear helpful or important. Craddock nodded. And what of the others? Tommy and Mr. Cudamore? They too may have seen something, or nothing at all. But I believe that one of the three has a reason to mislead us. Craddock turned sharply. A reason? You think there's more to this than a trespasser? Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice grew faintly sharper. Inspector, people do not lie unless they have something to hide. A trivial untruth, perhaps, but a motive nonetheless. Craddock's expression grew thoughtful. Miss Marple continued, I should like to speak next with Mrs. Weatherby. Her account was the most understated. That usually indicates truth rather than performance. Craddock chuckled. You do have a way of reading people, Miss Marple. It is simply observation. Human nature, after all, never truly changes. Craddock nodded, then said, Well, if Mrs. Weatherby heard movement at the cottage earlier than the others witnessed anything, that means, Miss Marple interrupted gently, we must consider the possibility of not one visitor, but two. Craddock stared. Two? Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking into motion once more. Yes, Inspector, two persons whose separate presence could create precisely the conflicting accounts we have heard. And if that is the case, Craddock said slowly, then the question is... Miss Marple finished the thought softly. What brought two different people, at two different times, to the same empty cottage? She continued knitting as the silence settled between them. Craddock looked at her with fresh interest, and perhaps a touch of concern. And more importantly, Miss Marple said in her gentle, unmistakably shrewd voice, which of our witnesses already knows the answer and is attempting to conceal it? Chapter 3. Mrs. Weatherby's Whispered Clue. The afternoon sun slanted across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting the village in a warm, honey-colored glow as Miss Marple made her way along the narrow footpath toward the Weatherby cottage. It was a pleasant walk, past hedgerows humming with bees and the faint, crisp scent of freshly baked bread drifting from the high street. Yet beneath the village's tranquil charm, Miss Marple felt something subtle shifting, like a faint crack beneath a polished surface. Mrs. Weatherby was not a woman given to exaggeration, and that alone made her account worthy of closer attention. Where Mrs. Finch fretted, Miss Hartwell dramatized, and Mr. Cudamore complained, Mrs. Weatherby simply observed, and Miss Marple valued that. She found the elderly woman in her rose garden, pruning shears in hand and a shawl tucked around her shoulders despite the lingering warmth. Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple called gently. The old woman turned, her lined face softening. Miss Marple, I wondered if you might come. Miss Marple smiled. I thought a little chat might be of help, may I? Mrs. Weatherby nodded and gestured to a wooden bench beneath a rose arch. You'd better sit, she said. I've been thinking about what I heard this morning. They settled into the quiet corner of the garden. Bees buzzed lazily among the blooms. A robin tugged at a worm in the soil. It was all very peaceful, but Mrs. Weatherby's thin fingers fidgeted with the edge of her shawl, revealing an unease she rarely allowed others to see. "You said," Miss Marple began gently, "that you heard noises before sunrise." "Yes," Mrs. Weatherby replied, her pale eyes focused on the roses. "At about 6:45, perhaps a few minutes earlier." "And the sound was inside the cottage?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Weatherby said. "Quite certain. I hear everything on this lane. You know I wake early. Habit from my late husband's days. I was in the kitchen when I heard a rustle, very soft, then a click, like a latch on a window." Miss Marple nodded. "Did it seem hurried or cautious?" "Cautious," Mrs. Weatherby said after a thoughtful pause. "Very cautious, not like someone breaking in for mischief, more like someone who didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple felt a small shiver of recognition. "And you saw nothing afterwards?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. Not long, but long enough for Miss Marple's curiosity to sharpen. "Well," she said slowly, "I did see someone, but only from behind, and only for a moment." Miss Marple's breath caught, not with surprise, but with delight. People often withheld their clearest memories until they felt safe enough to share them. "Do tell me," she said softly. Mrs. Weatherby sighed. "A figure walked from the side of the cottage, toward the back garden. I barely caught sight of them between the trees. They were carrying something small. I couldn't see what." "Could you tell if it was a man or a woman?" "No," she said firmly. "They wore a coat that covered everything, pale in color." Miss Marple stilled her hands. A pale coat. Tommy had mentioned seeing someone leaving the cottage in one, but he claimed it was around 7:30. "Approximately what time was this?" Miss Marple asked. "Just before 7, Mrs. Weatherby replied. "I remember because the church clock chimed shortly after." Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting again, rearranging themselves into an increasingly intriguing pattern. "You didn't mention this earlier," she said gently. Mrs. Weatherby looked down at her hands. "No. With everyone chattering and contradicting one another, well, I wasn't entirely sure what I saw, and one hesitates to add confusion." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "On the contrary, my dear, you may have seen the very thing that explains all the confusion." Mrs. Weatherby looked up sharply. "You think there were two people?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One in pale, one in dark, one entering, one leaving, one cautious, one hurried, one seen early, the other later?" "Yes, I believe so." Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "Then what on earth were they doing there?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is the question we must answer." She paused, studying the rose bush just beyond Mrs. Weatherby's shoulder. A small petal detached and fluttered to the ground. Soft. Silent. "Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said quietly, "this figure, the one in the pale coat, did they seem frightened?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened. "Yes," she whispered. "Now that you mention it, they did. Their posture was tight, their steps light and quick." "Running away from something," Miss Marple murmured, "or towards something important." Mrs. Weatherby watched her with anxious curiosity. "Do you think there's danger afoot?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not danger exactly, but there is something hidden. Something someone wishes very much to keep quiet." Mrs. Weatherby's voice dropped. "Do you think it has to do with that London gentleman? Or someone staying there secretly?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "The cottage being empty is precisely what makes it attractive. To far more people than the owner, I suspect." Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "You're thinking of secrets." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Secrets have a curious way of creating conflicting accounts. Everyone sees a different part of the truth. A long silence settled between them. Then Mrs. Weatherby said almost in a whisper, "There is one more thing." Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill. "Yes?" "In the back garden," Mrs. Weatherby said. "Just after I saw the figure walk away, I noticed a glint of something in the grass. Something shiny. I didn't dare pick it up." "What sort of shine?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. "A bright one, like metal catching the morning sun." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Instantly. A metallic object, a window latch click, a cautious figure in pale. Something left behind. "Mrs. Weatherby," she said softly, "that may be the first true clue we've heard." Mrs. Weatherby looked troubled. "Should I tell the inspector?" "You should," Miss Marple said gently, "and I shall look as well, but quietly." The older woman nodded, relieved to hand the burden to someone who understood its weight. As Miss Marple walked away from the Weatherby cottage, the village once again appeared peaceful and ordinary. But beneath that calm surface, she sensed a story beginning to unfold. A story of early hours, hushed movements, hidden objects, and two figures whose paths crossed at an empty cottage. And somewhere among the witnesses, someone already knew far more than they had said. Miss Marple tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Her steps remained gentle and steady, but her eyes shone with unmistakable resolve. There was a truth buried in St. Mary Mead, and she intended to find it. Chapter 4. A misleading footpath clue. The morning sun filtered softly through the high branches surrounding St. Mary Mead's old footpath, turning the narrow trail into a mosaic of gold and green. It was a path familiar to every villager. Lovers walked it, gardeners gathered wildflowers from its verge, and children pretended it led to enchanted forests. To Miss Marple, however, the footpath had always carried a different significance. Human beings, she often said, were creatures of habit. When something, or someone, disturbed the habitual, a clue usually lingered behind. This particular morning she walked with a gentle, measured pace, her gloved hands folded behind her. The incident at Meadow Lane continued to puzzle her. 4 villagers claiming to have witnessed the same moment, yet every account differed in some crucial way. Witness statements, she knew, were frequently unreliable, but 4 conflicting descriptions. That was not simply forgetfulness. That was design. She paused at a bend in the path, her eyes quietly alert. Something had been troubling her since her tea with Mrs. Bramwell. The matter of the coat. Mrs. Bramwell insisted she saw Mr. Cottrell wearing a dark green overcoat during the incident, yet Miss Tilly declared outright that he wore no coat at all. Mr. Cottrell himself said he'd been in shirt sleeves. It could have been vanity, she supposed. Men sometimes lied about unflattering outerwear. But the others? Why would they misremember such a simple detail? Her attention shifted as she reached a section of the footpath unusually disturbed. The soft earth bore a series of impressions, shallow yet distinct. Someone had passed through here recently, and quite hurriedly. The edges had not been softened by overnight dew. Miss Marple knelt with surprising ease for her age, examining the prints. "Now that is most interesting," she murmured. 2 sets of tracks, overlapping. One pair smaller, lighter, perhaps a woman's walking shoes. The second deeper, wider apart. A man's stride. She touched the soil lightly, not more than a few hours old, which begged the question, who had reason to rush along this path so early? Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing dust from her gloves. A quiet rustling to her right made her turn, and a moment later the Reverend Leonard Clement emerged from behind a hawthorn bush, holding a notebook and wearing an expression of mild alarm. "My dear Miss Marple, what a surprise. Or perhaps not," he said, offering a faint, amused smile. I might have known you'd be out here before half of us had finished breakfast. And good morning to you, Reverend, she replied warmly. I see you've come to observe the tracks as well. He hesitated, then cleared his throat softly. Well, yes, though I confess I hadn't expected quite so many. One wonders what compelled someone to run through here at such an hour. She gave him a thoughtful look. Indeed, people seldom hurry unless they are late, frightened, or hiding. The Reverend blinked. Hiding? You believe the footpath is connected to the incident? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued walking, directing him to follow. She stopped a few yards farther where the ground gave way to gravel impossible to read. But a small scrap of fabric lay caught on a low thorn. She retrieved it carefully, a sliver of dark green wool. Uh-huh, the Reverend murmured. Yes, Miss Marple said simply. A coat, and if I'm not mistaken, very much like the one Mrs. Bramwell described. But Mr. Cottrell claims he never wore one. Quite so, she said. Which means either Mrs. Bramwell imagined it, or she saw someone else wearing it. The Reverend frowned. But who? The village isn't exactly brimming with dark green coats. Not brimming, but not empty either, Miss Marple replied. There's Major Linton's hunting coat. Mrs. Godfrey owns a green woolen walking cape, rather fashionable, though she rarely admits it. And then, she paused delicately, then there's young Martin Wade, who borrowed a coat last winter and never returned it. The Reverend nodded slowly. You suspect one of them may have been on this path around the time of the incident? I suspect, Miss Marple said gently, that someone hoped to create an impression. A false one, naturally. Footpaths are dreadfully revealing once one knows how to read them. They walked farther along the trail, the birds singing mildly above them, the village's distant chimneys just visible between trees. It was a peaceful landscape, the sort of place where nothing sinister ought to occur. Yet it was precisely such villages Miss Marple always thought where secrets settled like dust in old cupboards. Just ahead the footpath forked. One route led toward the meadow behind the Cottrell house, the other wound toward the small woodland where children played. Miss Marple stood at the split, her gaze sweeping the ground. There, on the left path, was a faint heel mark, distinctively narrow. This way, she said. They followed the trail deeper until the trees thickened. A small clearing greeted them, rarely used except by local youngsters. And there, half hidden beneath a fallen branch, lay something surprising. A handkerchief neatly embroidered with the initials G.B. Gwendolyn Bramwell, the Reverend breathed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yes, and I very much doubt she dropped it accidentally. Mrs. Bramwell prides herself on tidiness. Do you suppose she was here after seeing the incident? Perhaps she followed someone. Or, Miss Marple said softly, she met someone. A hush settled between them. The Reverend seemed uneasy, shifting weight from foot to foot. But what would she be doing here? And why lie about the coat? Miss Marple folded the handkerchief carefully. Human motives, dear Reverend, are rarely simple. But I believe Mrs. Bramwell saw more than she intended, or wished, to admit. And I dare say she is not the only one. They returned to the footpath, Miss Marple moving with a seriousness that the Reverend had come to recognize. She had found something, not a solution, not yet, but something essential, a contradiction anchored in physical evidence. Someone had been on this path wearing a green coat. Someone had hurried. Someone had left a clue they had not meant to leave. As they reached the path's entrance once more, Miss Marple paused, gazing back thoughtfully. The trouble with misleading clues, she murmured, is that they often reveal more truth than the ones deliberately planted. The Reverend nodded, though he looked thoroughly perplexed. "Do you believe this footpath tells a different story than the witnesses?" "Not different," Miss Marple corrected. "Simply more honest." And with that she continued on toward the village, her expression serene, yet her mind quietly weaving the emerging threads into something far more intricate than anyone yet suspected. Chapter 5. The Locked Cottage Mystery. By late morning, the Miller cottage had taken on an almost mystical significance in the village gossip. Its shuttered windows and neatly kept but lonely garden became a stage upon which every imagination performed its own scene. Mrs. Finch, Miss Hartwell, and a small cluster of curious onlookers hovered at the edges of the lane, whispering speculations while Inspector Craddock maintained a polite but watchful distance. And at the center of it all, quietly observing, was Miss Marple. The cottage, despite its outward tranquility, held secrets in its very timbers, she thought. Today the air seemed heavier, as if the old walls themselves were bracing for discovery. Miss Marple approached the front gate, noting how the latch had been recently oiled. An ordinary touch, yet oddly reassuring to anyone seeking to understand the habits of those who lived there. Inspector Craddock, standing just behind her, gave a faint shrug. No sign of forced entry. Front door firmly locked, windows all secure. He looked about at the small crowd with an expression that combined frustration and mild amusement. And yet we're left with the same puzzling problem. Someone was seen inside the cottage, or not, depending on whom you believe. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A locked door does not always mean an empty house, Inspector. Her voice carried the gentle authority of a woman accustomed to reading between lines of dialogue, between shadows of gesture. Craddock raised his eyebrows, though he was hardly surprised. He had long since learned that Miss Marple's gentle authority often revealed truths he had overlooked. She stepped closer to the door, examining the small brass keyhole polished to a muted shine. The absence of scratches suggested careful handling. Someone had unlocked this door, or entered by other means, with an almost studied precision. She ran her fingers along the frame, noting faint marks, too small to be casual, too deliberate to be accidental. "There is more than one way into a house," she murmured almost to herself. "And sometimes the simplest explanation is the most cunningly concealed." Craddock tilted his head. "You think they came through the window?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she crouched briefly, scanning the base of the walls for disturbances in the earth. There it was, a faint indentation in the soil by the side window, partially hidden beneath a rose bush. A delicate disturbance, hardly noticeable to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to someone who observed as she did. "Indeed," she said at last, "there has been entry here by this side window, and it has been carefully restored afterward to appear untouched. Clever, yet not clever enough." Mrs. Weatherby had joined them quietly, her curiosity palpable. She leaned in, whispering, "Do you think it was the same person we saw, or someone else entirely?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That is precisely the question, Mrs. Weatherby. One figure may have entered, another may have left, and one of them may have left a clue too delicate to notice at first glance." Craddock, never one to resist a practical suggestion, went to the side window and examined it carefully. The latch appeared intact, yet when he gently applied pressure to the frame, he detected a subtle give. "Huh," he murmured. "It is loose. Could be forced with care." Miss Marple nodded. "Or someone knew it to be weaker. Knowledge, after all, is more valuable than strength." She glanced at Mrs. Weatherby. "You mentioned a metallic glint yesterday morning?" "Yes," Mrs. Weatherby said softly. "I thought it might be a piece of jewelry or perhaps a tool, but I didn't dare touch it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "It was left deliberately, or perhaps forgotten in haste. Either way, it speaks to the person's presence more reliably than words ever could. The inspector straightened. You mean to say there was someone here with purpose and someone else with haste? Exactly, Miss Marple replied. Two figures, two intentions. One calm, observing, the other hurried, possibly distracted. The villagers around them leaned forward, drawn by the authority of her voice, yet careful not to interrupt. Even the most skeptical onlooker could sense that the old lady's deductions carried weight far beyond their apparent gentleness. Miss Marple circled the cottage, examining every bush and corner. Her gaze paused at the back garden, where dew still clung to the grass in sparkling beads. A faint trail led from the window toward the narrow hedge separating the cottage from the neighboring meadow. The prints were subtle, too faint for anyone but a practiced eye to notice, but she traced them carefully, committing the pattern to memory. See here, she said, kneeling and pointing with a slender finger. Someone walked swiftly, carrying something small, not heavy but precious to them, and they veered deliberately away from the main path, avoiding observation. Whoever this was, they knew our village's habits well. Craddock followed her gaze, frowning. It is as if they planned their timing and perhaps their story in advance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Stories, Inspector, are often crafted like footprints. They are left to mislead or protect. Some are accidental, some intentional, and sometimes both. A sudden movement behind the rose hedge caught her attention. She straightened, her keen eyes narrowing. From behind the foliage, a small, dark bundle appeared, an envelope addressed in a neat, unfamiliar hand. She picked it up carefully, noting the absence of fingerprints, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a brief note written in a delicate hand. Look to the side window. The truth lies where the shadow falls. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. She handed the note to Craddock. There. Even misdirection carries a clue if one reads it carefully. Craddock read the note aloud, brow furrowing. The side window. Shadow. You mean someone is leading us to the truth? Perhaps, she said, or perhaps testing whether we can recognize it. Either way, it confirms that entry was made and that someone wishes to draw attention away from the actual event inside. The crowd murmured quietly, some glancing uneasily at one another. Miss Marple's eyes swept over them. The note, the footprints, the subtle indentation of soil, all spoke of careful planning. Yet even the cleverest misdirection could not erase the evidence entirely. Now, she said, rising, I suggest we all retire briefly. Time often clarifies things that are muddled in haste and confusion. Craddock nodded, though he looked thoughtful, almost impressed. Miss Marple, you always seem to find the thread that others overlook. It is merely attention, she replied, smiling faintly. Attention to small things, to tiny disturbances, to contradictions. They seldom lie, even when people do. As the inspector and villagers departed for a short respite, Miss Marple remained near the cottage, surveying the quiet scene. The locked door, the side window, the footprints, and the cryptic note all pointed to a mystery that was becoming clearer in her mind, though the pieces were still delicate and easily disturbed. Somewhere within the calm of St. Mary Mead, someone was hiding more than mere footsteps. And Miss Marple knew that, with patience, every hidden thread could be untangled. The cottage, so ordinary in its appearance, now held the first whispers of truth. And Miss Marple intended to follow those whispers, wherever they might lead. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath the Garden. By mid-afternoon, the Miller cottage seemed almost ordinary again, its quiet facade betraying none of the earlier excitement. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the neat flower beds and well-tended lawn, secrets lingered, as stubborn as the ivy clinging to the stone walls. She had returned to the side garden, the small path leading to the hedge that concealed the faint footprints she had observed earlier. The pale sunlight dappled the ground, casting shadows that shifted and stretched like whispered hints across the soil. Mrs. Weatherby had joined her again, carrying a small basket with gardening tools. "I thought it best to help, Miss Marple," she said. "One never knows what might be discovered, and my hands are better suited to gentle digging than anything forceful." "Quite right, my dear," Miss Marple said, smiling. "We must tread carefully. Evidence, after all, is as delicate as a spider's web. Too much disturbance and it vanishes." They began walking slowly along the faint trail left by the hurried figure, carefully examining every patch of grass. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp and observant, noting the subtle depressions, the traces of displaced soil, the occasional leaf that had been brushed aside. The trail led directly to the hedge, where the soil appeared unusually soft. "Here," Miss Marple said, kneeling to examine it. Someone paused. "There is weight in the center and displacement at the edges, and the imprint of a small object carried in haste is just visible." Mrs. Weatherby peered over her shoulder. "Could it be a dropped tool?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "or something more important. Observe the slight indentation in the soil." She gently pressed her gloved fingers against it, feeling the compressed earth. "It is shallow yet deliberate, not casual." As they continued, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the various villagers who had passed through this space. Each had left an impression, whether through words, gestures, or subtle actions. Some deliberately misleading, others entirely unconscious of the truth they carried. Among them, she knew the story of the Miller cottage was slowly revealing its hidden pattern. "Do you notice," she said to Mrs. Weatherby, "how this path curves slightly to the left, just here?" She indicated the ground. "It is a natural choice to avoid visibility from the main road. Whoever walked here wished to remain unseen, yet could not resist leaving traces of their passage. Human nature, after all, is not easily suppressed." Mrs. Weatherby nodded slowly, as though absorbing both the explanation and the weight of its implications. "You mean they wanted to be secret, yet left the proof anyway?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "Even the cleverest must leave a mark, whether they intend to or not. And these marks often reveal more than the stories people tell aloud." They reached the hedge at last. The soil beneath the low branches bore the faintest sign of disturbance, a rectangular impression in the earth, barely visible in the soft afternoon light. Miss Marple crouched to examine it. "Ah," she murmured. "Here lies the key." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened. "The key?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, brushing away the remaining soil. "Someone hid a small object here, likely intending to retrieve it later. The shape suggests a metal key, perhaps the one used to enter the cottage earlier." Just as she spoke, a slight movement near the hedge drew their attention. A young boy, cheeks flushed and eyes wide with curiosity, emerged from behind the branches. "I saw someone put it there," he exclaimed. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And you have brought us to it?" The boy nodded eagerly. "I was too scared to take it myself. They looked angry if anyone saw them." Miss Marple smiled, gently taking the key from its shallow hiding place. "Brave and truthful. That is often the combination we need." She examined it carefully, noting the faint scratches along the metal, marks of repeated use. "This key has opened more than one door, I suspect," she murmured. "And the person who carried it clearly intended to return." Craddock, who had arrived quietly behind them, took the key and turned it over in his hand. "This matches the lock at the side window exactly," he said. "So we know for certain that someone did enter from there." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But notice the faint green fibers caught along the key's edge. Someone wore a coat pale in color when handling it. Mrs. Weatherby looked puzzled. A pale coat? I thought the figure in the garden wore dark. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Exactly. Two different people carrying out two different actions. One cautious, leaving evidence deliberately, one hurried, perhaps unaware of the marks they left behind. Craddock frowned, but Miss Marple pressed on. Now consider the motive. Someone left. The cottage unlocked deliberately, allowing access for a brief moment. Someone else retrieved a hidden object, perhaps unaware of its importance, or in haste to conceal their presence. Mrs. Weatherby whispered, "Do you think it's related to the note we found earlier?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Every action, every trace points to a hidden intention, and every witness, from Mrs. Finch to Miss Hartwell, has noticed a fragment of it. Our task is to assemble the fragments into a coherent whole." A gentle wind rustled the leaves above them, carrying the faint scent of roses and damp earth. Miss Marple stood, brushing her hands lightly against her skirt. "Observe, dear friends, that in mysteries the smallest actions often reveal the largest truths. The key, the footprints, the hidden note, each one speaks of a careful plan interrupted by haste or circumstance." Craddock shook his head with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple, yet I know it is far from so." "It is never simple," she said softly. "But the truth is always present, waiting for someone to notice the subtle disturbances. And now, with this key and the evidence in the garden, we are much closer to understanding the events of that early morning." Mrs. Weatherby watched her with quiet awe. "I hope the others will be as honest when asked." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Honesty is a curious thing. It comes in many forms, in words, in action, and even in the way one steps along a garden path. Today, the truth has begun to reveal itself. Tomorrow we shall see more clearly who moved in darkness and who moved in haste. With that, she tucked the key safely into her pocket, giving one last glance over the garden. The soft shadows stretched across the cottage, whispering of secrets yet to be uncovered. And in the calm of the afternoon, Miss Marple knew the threads were slowly, inevitably coming together, waiting for the final unraveling. Chapter 7: The Village Secrets Unfold. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a gentle mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened the outlines of every cottage. The village, tranquil as ever, seemed unaware of the intricate puzzle slowly unraveling within its boundaries. Miss Marple, however, was anything but unaware. She had spent the early hours reviewing the evidence collected so far, the footprints along the footpath, the mysterious key, the fragments of pale and dark coats, and the conflicting accounts from the villagers. Each clue, she mused, was a small stroke in a much larger picture. By 10 o'clock, she had arranged a small meeting in her sitting room, inviting the most significant witnesses: Mrs. Weatherby, Mrs. Finch, Miss Hartwell, and, somewhat reluctantly, young Martin Wade. Inspector Craddock also attended, standing slightly apart as he observed Miss Marple's methodical approach. She had arranged the chairs in a circle, believing that careful conversation often revealed what questioning could not. "Thank you all for coming," she began gently, pouring tea for everyone. "We have had many observations, and some of them disagree. Yet I believe that, when we listen carefully, the truth can be heard even through contradictory accounts." Mrs. Finch stirred her tea nervously. "I still cannot see how my own observation could have been wrong. I saw the figure clearly." "Ah," Miss Marple said with her characteristic soft smile. "But clarity of vision does not always correspond to understanding. Sometimes we see what we expect to see rather than what actually occurs." Miss Hartwell looked indignant. "You imply I imagined the man in the dark coat." "Not imagined," Miss Marple replied kindly. Rather, perhaps you witnessed a different moment or a different person entirely. The same location can host multiple actions, each unnoticed by some and misinterpreted by others. She poured herself a cup of tea and took a measured sip, letting the warmth and calm settle over the room. Consider this, she continued. We have evidence of two figures in the vicinity of the Miller cottage early yesterday morning. One wore a pale coat, moving cautiously and leaving subtle traces. Another wore a dark coat, moving more hurriedly, observed by several villagers at slightly later times. This explains why accounts appear conflicting. Both are accurate, but each describes a different visitor. Martin Wade, who had been unusually quiet, fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. Miss Marple noticed the movement. "And you, Martin," she said gently, "may have seen something you did not understand at the time." The boy's eyes widened. I think I saw someone taking something from the back garden. They didn't see me. I hid behind the hedge. It was dark and they were wearing a green coat. They dropped a small key when they ran and I thought they might be in trouble." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Exactly. And that key has now been recovered, confirming your observation." Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward, excitement mingled with concern. Then the person in the pale coat. Could they have been responsible for all the disturbances? Or was it the one in dark? Miss Marple folded her hands. Both played their parts. One, deliberate and cautious, may have had a specific purpose in mind. The other, hasty and unobserved, acted either in error or under duress. And between them a series of small misunderstandings arose, compounded by our own interpretations of their actions. Inspector Craddock, ever practical, asked, "So you're saying there isn't just one culprit?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "The person who created the misdirection may not be the person who benefited from it. And the object they sought, the reason for the hurried movement, remains a central question. But now we are narrowing our possibilities." Miss Hartwell stirred, looking uneasy. "And what about the note we found? The one that mentioned the side window and the shadow?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The note, while cryptic, served as a guide. It confirmed that someone wished attention drawn to a specific location. The shadow, I believe, refers to an early morning detail often overlooked. The angle of the sunlight illuminating the side window. It is subtle, yet revealing." Mrs. Finch wrinkled her nose. "Subtle. It all seems so convoluted. Why would anyone make it so difficult?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "people rarely act out of pure simplicity. Most actions are layered with intention, some conscious, some unconscious. And clever misdirection is often intended to protect secrets, not to harm anyone." Martin nodded eagerly. "I think I understand. Someone wanted to hide what they were doing, but they weren't careful enough. That's why we noticed footprints, and the key, and the handkerchief with initials." Miss Marple reached for the handkerchief Martin produced, examining it closely. "Yes. GB. We now know who was present, but we must also consider why. People rarely go to such lengths without a compelling reason. Perhaps fear, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps a need to reclaim something lost." Inspector Craddock scratched his chin. "And the pale coat, the green coat, do they indicate the same person at different times or two different people?" "Two different people," Miss Marple said with gentle certainty. "One cautious, one hasty. Their interactions are the source of the confusion. The villagers observed separate events, and naturally their accounts appear contradictory. Once we place the correct sequence, the puzzle resolves itself." Mrs. Weatherby leaned back, sipping her tea. "And what of the motive? Why go to the cottage at such an early hour?" Miss Marple regarded her quietly. A motive often reveals itself in the simplest of observations. A hidden object, a forgotten item, or a secret long held can compel even the most timid person to act in secrecy. It is rarely grand, and often very human. The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Miss Marple, with her keen eyes resting on each face in turn, allowed the moment to linger. Each witness was beginning to see that their own perception, while valuable, was only part of a broader tapestry. Finally, she spoke again. Tomorrow we shall visit the cottage with careful attention to the sequence of events. We will examine the side window, the hedge, and the back garden. And then, step by step, we will determine who moved, when, and why. Once the sequence is clear, the truth will emerge and the conflicting accounts will finally align. Inspector Craddock, leaning against the mantel, nodded with admiration. You always make it seem so straightforward, Miss Marple. Not straightforward, she corrected gently. Just observed. And remember, observations like footprints or the glint of a key rarely lie. People do. The group fell silent again, reflecting on the detective's words. Outside, the village continued its gentle rhythm. A cart rattling along the lane, a blackbird calling from the hedge, and children's laughter drifting from the meadows. Yet beneath the calm surface, Miss Marple sensed the pieces of the puzzle beginning to move into place, drawing together the threads of the mystery that had, until now, seemed so fractured. By the time tea was finished, everyone left Miss Marple's sitting room with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. The shadows of confusion had begun to lift, replaced by the soft light of insight. And though no final answers had yet been declared, one fact had become evident. The village of St. Mary Mead held its secrets close, but Miss Marple, with patience and observation, would soon uncover them all. Chapter 8. The Crucial Discovery. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying the scent of dew on the grass and the faint tang of coal smoke from the village chimneys. Miss Marple set out toward the Miller cottage with a quiet determination, her mind fully occupied with the intricate puzzle she had been assembling over the past days. Today promised something different. A breakthrough, she felt instinctively, though she would not presume to name it until she had the evidence clearly before her. Inspector Craddock followed at a measured pace, careful not to disturb Miss Marple's train of thought. Mrs. Weatherby and young Martin Wade had joined them, bringing with them a sense of gentle curiosity and unspoken hope. They approached the cottage along the familiar footpath, where the disturbed soil still bore faint traces of hurried passage, now faintly softened by the morning dew. Miss Marple paused, studying the impressions. These footprints, though softened, still tell a story, she murmured, one cautious figure and one in haste. Their paths crossed here, leaving traces of intention and error alike. Martin, peering at the soil, whispered, I think I remember this part. Someone ran this way, then paused, then turned back. Precisely, Miss Marple said, nodding. And notice the small depression just beyond the hedge. A key was once hidden here. Someone retrieved it, and that act is essential to understanding the sequence of events. Inspector Craddock frowned. The key? So the person in the green coat retrieved it, then what? Miss Marple led the group to the side window, crouching slightly to examine the latch. The key fits here, she said softly, but notice how the latch has been slightly bent, suggesting repeated use. This window was the entry point, deliberately chosen yet carefully concealed. The person who used it knew the cottage well. Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. And the person in the pale coat? They came later? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. The pale coat figure followed, but with a different purpose. Observe the disturbed flower bed. The earth has been pressed down slightly, as though someone knelt to examine or retrieve something. These subtle marks are far more revealing than casual observation. Martin's eyes widened. So two people doing different things in the same place? Exactly, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. And each left their own truth behind, even when they intended deception. She rose and moved toward the back garden where the rose bushes brushed against the fence and the early morning sun glinted across the wet leaves. There, just beneath the low branches, she paused. A faint glimmer caught her eye. Something metallic half buried in the soil. She knelt and carefully extracted it. A small silver locket, delicately engraved with the initials GB. "Ah," she murmured, holding it up to catch the sunlight. "Here lies the central clue. It has been hidden, retrieved, and perhaps forgotten in haste. The person in the dark green coat sought it. The pale coat figure came after, either to observe or to recover." Inspector Craddock examined the locket with interest. "So GB is the owner? That would be Mrs. Bramwell." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and the locket contains a secret she hoped to protect. Observe how carefully the soil has been replaced around it. It was meant to conceal, not to harm." Mrs. Weatherby leaned in, whispering, "Do you think she knew someone else might come?" "I suspect she did," Miss Marple said, turning the locket in her gloved hands. "And that anticipation explains the two separate figures, one retrieving, one observing. The pale coat figure, cautious, deliberate, likely intended to monitor the action, ensuring that the locket was safely returned without disruption." Martin nodded eagerly. "And the dark coat figure? They were in a hurry and dropped the key?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Their haste left traces, both in the soil and in the sequence of events, and that is why witnesses saw conflicting actions. They observed separate individuals at different times, yet their minds tried to weave it into a single narrative." Inspector Craddock rubbed his chin. "So it was never a single intruder or thief?" "No," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "It was a coordinated sequence of human intentions, each with its own subtle imprint, and that coordination, or lack thereof, created the confusion we observed in the statements of villagers." Mrs. Weatherby, still gazing at the locket, asked softly, "But why such secrecy? Why risk coming here so early?" Miss Marple looked over the garden, considering the angle of the sunlight and the shadows it cast. "Because this locket carries more than mere sentiment. It is evidence of past connections, of promises, of perhaps a misunderstanding that must remain hidden. Secrets of the heart often require extraordinary care, and St. Mary Mead, though gentle in appearance, is full of such delicate histories." The soft rustling of leaves seemed to punctuate her words. She stood and returned the locket to the small hollow in the soil, covering it carefully as if to demonstrate how it had been handled. "Notice how minimal the disturbance is. The careful steps, the cautious handling, all suggest someone with knowledge and care. No one else could manage it so delicately without leaving more obvious traces." Inspector Craddock glanced around the garden. "And the witnesses? They misinterpreted the events because they saw only fragments." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Human perception is naturally selective. We notice what is familiar or what we expect. When two people act sequentially, their actions are often conflated into one. That explains all the conflicting statements, and now we can piece together the real sequence." Martin, still wide-eyed, asked, "Will Mrs. Bramwell be safe? And is she the one who hid it?" "She is," Miss Marple confirmed gently. "And yes, she will be safe. Her concern was only that the locket be handled with care and that any observation be discreet. That is why the pale coat figure acted as they did, to monitor, protect, and ensure nothing was lost." Craddock nodded slowly, absorbing the clarity Miss Marple provided. "So everything, the key, the footprints, the handkerchief, fits perfectly now." Miss Marple allowed a small smile. "Indeed, and the final confirmation will come when we speak with the individuals involved. But the crucial discovery here in this garden has revealed the truth hidden in plain sight. Human intent, carefully concealed, yet leaving its gentle traces for an observant eye. The soft afternoon sun fell across the cottage, casting long shadows over the rose bushes. Miss Marple, standing with a serene expression, felt the puzzle beginning to resolve. The villagers' secrets, the footsteps, the hidden locket, all were threads now drawn toward the inevitable conclusion. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we shall uncover the final pieces. And when we do, the story of the Miller cottage will finally make sense, not as a collection of contradictions, but as a carefully orchestrated sequence of events, revealed through observation, patience, and a touch of understanding." Chapter 9. The Dramatic Revelation. By late afternoon, a quiet hush had settled over the Miller cottage and its surrounding garden. The usual village sounds, the clip-clop of a passing horse, the soft laughter of children, the distant clatter of a cart, seemed to fade into a gentle stillness. Inside, Miss Marple had invited the key villagers to the sitting room. Mrs. Bramwell, Mrs. Finch, Miss Hartwell, young Martin Wade, and, of course, Inspector Craddock. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if the room itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the truths to emerge. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair, looked around at the assembled faces. "We have all played a part in the story," she began softly. "And now it is time to weave together the threads of observation, intention, and circumstance." She held the small silver locket in her hand, allowing its sunlight-reflecting surface to catch the attention of everyone present. This locket has been at the heart of the events that so puzzled us. Its hiding and retrieval created footprints, keys, and notes that led to confusion, but also fortuitously to discovery. Mrs. Bramwell's eyes widened slightly, though she maintained an air of composure. "Yes, but how did you know it all?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Careful observation, my dear. Small details, easily overlooked, often speak louder than words. The footprints along the footpath, the indentation in the garden soil, the side windows' subtle signs of use. They told a story that human eyes sometimes miss, but that a careful mind can read." Inspector Craddock leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So the conflicting accounts we received, the dark coat, the pale coat, the hurried and the cautious, are explained by the fact that more than one person was involved?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "The first figure wearing the dark green coat entered the garden in haste, dropped the key, and inadvertently left clues that were misinterpreted by the villagers. The second figure, wearing the pale coat, acted more deliberately, recovering the locket and ensuring it remained safe, while also observing the actions of the first. Each individual's actions were accurate, yet seen in isolation they seemed contradictory." Mrs. Finch frowned, shaking her head. "But why all this secrecy? Why not simply leave the locket where it was?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. Because the locket is not merely a piece of jewelry. It contains memories and sentiments that Mrs. Bramwell wished to protect, and perhaps to reveal only when she deemed the moment right. Human motives are often more delicate than they appear." Mrs. Bramwell, now fully attentive, spoke softly. "It is true. The locket belonged to my late mother. I feared that if its presence in the cottage were known too widely, it might be misunderstood or worse, taken. The events yesterday were my attempt to retrieve it discreetly, ensuring it was returned to safety." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And the hurried figure in the dark coat, was that you, Mrs. Bramwell?" "Yes," Mrs. Bramwell admitted. "I did not wish to alarm anyone or create a spectacle. I acted quickly, hoping to remain unseen, and I feared someone might watch and misinterpret my actions." Martin Wade, still wide-eyed, spoke up. "So the person in the pale coat, the one who watched, was protecting you?" Indeed, Miss Marple said. The pale coat figure acted as a safeguard, ensuring that the retrieval of the locket went smoothly. Their careful attention prevented a potential mishap, and their presence explains the overlapping footprints and subtle disturbances in the garden. Inspector Craddock leaned back, a faint smile appearing. And the handkerchief with the initials GB? That was left behind accidentally? Yes, Miss Marple said. A small oversight in the midst of a delicate operation. Such tiny clues often reveal what larger actions conceal. Even the most careful of plans may leave traces if one observes closely enough. Miss Hartwell, who had been silent until now, spoke in a cautious tone. And all the villagers who saw the activity, they weren't lying. They just saw different moments. Precisely, Miss Marple replied. Human memory and perception are naturally selective. People observe what they notice, what they expect, or what is most striking. When two individuals act separately, the combination of these observations can create apparent contradictions. Once the sequence is understood, however, all accounts align. Mrs. Weatherby, still seated nearby, added softly, "So everything that puzzled us, the footprints, the key, the conflicting reports, they were all part of one story told in fragments." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And now, with all present, we can see the full narrative." Mrs. Bramwell retrieved her locket in secrecy. The pale coat figure safeguarded the action, and the villagers' observations, though seemingly conflicting, were accurate reflections of different moments. A gentle pause fell over the room as the villagers absorbed this revelation. The room, once filled with confusion and quiet curiosity, now seemed suffused with clarity and understanding. Even the inspector allowed himself a faint chuckle of satisfaction. "So it was never a crime, then," Mrs. Finch said, her tone a mixture of relief and amusement. "Just a very careful plan to protect a precious possession?" "Exactly," Miss Marple confirmed. "No harm, no malice. Only careful attention to human habits, timing, and the need for discretion. Sometimes mysteries are solved not through confrontation or conflict, but through observation and patience." Mrs. Bramwell smiled, her earlier anxiety softened into quiet relief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I feared the events might be misinterpreted entirely, but now everything is clear." Martin Wade, still holding a sense of awe, whispered, "I never thought a locket could cause so much confusion." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Even the smallest objects can set human motives into motion, Martin, and in villages such as St. Mary Mead, seemingly minor actions often carry the most significance." Inspector Craddock looked at Miss Marple with admiration. "You always manage to find the truth, Miss Marple, even when it seems hidden in shadows." She smiled warmly. "The truth rarely hides entirely, Inspector. It merely waits for the patient observer, someone willing to notice what others overlook and to read the subtleties of human behavior." The room fell into a gentle quiet, each person reflecting on the intricate yet ultimately harmless series of events that had unfolded. The tension that had seemed so palpable in the days prior now dissolved into understanding, and the warmth of the village's atmosphere returned. Miss Marple, quietly rising from her chair, glanced around at each face in turn. "And so the mystery of the Miller cottage is resolved. Human intentions, carefully concealed and partly misunderstood, have been revealed. And in the process, we have learned much, not only about the actions themselves, but about the way people see, interpret, and remember what they witness." As the visitors prepared to leave, the inspector gave a satisfied nod. "Another mystery neatly untangled, Miss Marple. Quite remarkable." She offered a gentle smile. "Not remarkable, simply attentive, and perhaps just a little patience." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting gentle light across the sitting room. Shadows shifted, yet the clarity of understanding remained. In St. Mary Mead, life would return to its gentle rhythms, and the events at the Miller cottage would be remembered not for confusion or scandal, but for the quiet demonstration of human care, observation, and the subtle triumph of clarity over misunderstanding. Chapter 10. Resolution over morning tea. The following morning, St. Mary Mead basked in a soft golden light, the mist of dawn lifting to reveal tidy gardens, cobblestone paths, and the quiet charm of village life. Miss Marple's sitting room was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea and warm scones. A sense of calm, almost ceremonious, pervaded the air as the key villagers gathered once more. Today was not a day for speculation or confusion. It was a day for reflection, explanation, and gentle closure. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the window, poured tea with meticulous care, ensuring each cup was placed just so. Mrs. Bramwell, Mrs. Finch, Miss Hartwell, and young Martin Wade occupied the other chairs, while Inspector Craddock stood respectfully by the doorway. The small, sunny room, with its floral curtains and polished oak furniture, provided a sense of warmth and reassurance, as though the very walls were intent on preserving the harmony of the village. "Thank you all for joining me once again," Miss Marple began, her voice soft, yet filled with quiet authority. "Yesterday we followed the threads of a puzzle that seemed complex, yet was, at heart, a simple matter of observation and human intent. Today we shall ensure that every action, every impression, and every motive is understood clearly." Mrs. Bramwell stirred her tea nervously. "I am still a little embarrassed by all the attention the locket has caused. I only wish to retrieve it quietly." "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "And yet it is precisely the desire for discretion that gave rise to such confusion. The overlapping actions of the dark coat figure, yourself, and the pale coat observer created the conflicting accounts that puzzled us so. But now all is clear." She gestured to Martin. "Young Martin, you observed the initial retrieval and found the key hidden beneath the hedge. That simple act of honesty allowed us to trace the sequence of events accurately." Martin blushed slightly. "I was just trying to help," he said softly. "And help you did," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Sometimes the smallest act of courage provides the largest insight. The truth often reveals itself through these tiny, overlooked moments." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, folding his hands. "So the mystery was never about theft or wrongdoing, but about protecting something valuable and sentimental?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "The locket belonged to Mrs. Bramwell's late mother. Its significance is emotional, not material. The careful concealment, the deliberate retrieval, and the observation by the pale coat figure, all were intended to safeguard a cherished possession rather than to deceive or harm anyone." Mrs. Finch, who had listened intently, asked, "And the conflicting statements from the villagers? Were they just honest mistakes?" Miss Marple nodded. "They were honest, yes, but incomplete. Each observer saw a fragment of the whole. The hurried actions of the dark coat figure and the careful movements of the pale coat figure occurred at different moments, yet the observations were merged in memory. Once we understood the sequence, the contradictions resolved themselves naturally," Miss Hartwell added. "And the note we found mentioning the shadow and the side window? The note served as guidance, a reminder to observe details often overlooked," Miss Marple explained. "The shadow referred to the early morning light, which illuminated the side window and allowed the pale coat figure to act with certainty. It was a subtle but deliberate aid, ensuring that nothing was misplaced and no trace left too obvious." Mrs. Bramwell sighed in relief. "I am glad it is all understood now. I feared the events might seem suspicious or that my intentions would be misread entirely." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Intentions, when observed carefully, reveal themselves. Human actions, even when shrouded in secrecy, leave traces for those willing to notice. You acted out of care, and that care is evident in the evidence you left behind. The key, the footprints, and the careful handling of the locket. She glanced at Martin. And you, dear boy, have demonstrated the importance of honesty and attention. Your observant nature allowed us to piece together the puzzle that might otherwise have remained unresolved. Martin's eyes shone. I'm glad I could help, he said quietly. Miss Marple poured a little more tea into her own cup and took a sip before continuing. The final lesson, perhaps, is this. Mysteries often arise not from malice, but from human nature. Our desire to protect, to act discreetly, to safeguard that which is precious. And when we combine careful observation with patience, even the most perplexing situation can be understood clearly. Inspector Craddock allowed himself a small smile. A tidy conclusion, Miss Marple. It is always remarkable how you uncover the truth through the smallest details. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The remarkable aspect is not in myself, Inspector, but in noticing what others overlook. A footprint, a key, a faint shadow. Each carries its own story. And once the observer reads it patiently, the narrative becomes clear. The room fell into a gentle silence, broken only by the soft clink of cups and the occasional sip of tea. Outside, birds called from the hedgerows and the warm sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows across the polished floor. The village, calm and orderly once again, seemed to breathe with relief. Mrs. Weatherby, who had been quietly observing, spoke softly. It is comforting to know that such care was taken and that no harm was done. The village remains as gentle and orderly as ever, thanks to your guidance, Miss Marple. Miss Marple inclined her head. Gentle, orderly, and observant. That is the essence of St. Mary Mead, and it is why, even when a mystery arises, we can resolve it with understanding, patience, and a little attention to detail. Mrs. Bramwell, holding her locket safely in her hands, finally relaxed, her tension replaced by quiet contentment. Thank you, Miss Marple. Your wisdom has restored peace to my home and to my heart. Miss Marple smiled warmly. All in a day's work, my dear. Sometimes the most profound mysteries are solved not with force, but with care, observation, and respect for human nature. And now, over this morning tea, we may all reflect on the events with clarity and gentle satisfaction. As the villagers chatted softly, sipping their tea and nibbling on scones, the quiet warmth of Miss Marple's sitting room seemed to settle over everyone, reaffirming the comforting rhythms of village life. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise, painting the hedgerows and cottages with a golden glow. A reminder that even after mystery and confusion, light and understanding return. With gentle smiles exchanged, the group departed one by one, leaving Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock alone in the calm room. The mystery of the Miller cottage had been resolved, the locket safely returned, and the sequence of events fully understood. And as the village went about its day, life in St. Mary Mead continued peaceful and orderly once more, with the quiet knowledge that even the most subtle mysteries could be unraveled with patience, attention, and a compassionate heart. Miss Marple, seated once more by her window, sipped her tea and looked out over the village. The shadows of yesterday's mystery had lifted, replaced by clarity and calm, and the gentle pulse of St. Mary Mead resumed, safe, serene, and quietly satisfied.